The air is thick. It smells of damp earth, sweat, and a metallic fear that coats your throat. For a 19-year-old Tomiko Higa, this small, dark cave on the island of Okinawa is the end of the world. What happens when the monster at your door doesn't have horns? If you believe these hidden histories must be told, subscribe now and tell us where you are watching from. Outside the cave, the monsters are coming, the Kichiku Beihei, the American demons. Every story she has ever been told, every warning from the Imperial soldiers, culminates in this moment. The grenade in her hand is not a weapon of defiance. It is a tool of release. The soldiers had been clear. Capture is a fate worse than any death, a promise of unspeakable violation, torture, and shame. Honor demanded only one path. April 1st, 1945, Easter Sunday. The largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War begins. For the Americans of the 10th Army, this was Operation Iceberg, the final step to mainland Japan. For the 300,000 civilians of Okinawa, it was an apocalypse. The naval bombardment was so immense, they called it the Typhoon of Steel. The island, once a peaceful hub of the Ryukyu Kingdom, was about to become a meat grinder. The Japanese 32nd Army, under General Mitsuru Ushijima, had turned Okinawa into a fortress, a web of interlocking caves, pillboxes, and tunnels. His strategy was not to win. It was to bleed the Americans dry, to make them pay for every inch of sacred soil in blood. The civilians were part of this defense. They were instruments of the state. The propaganda was relentless. American soldiers were subhuman beasts. Women were told they would be passed from man to man until they were dismembered. The Imperial Japanese Army distributed grenades, not for fighting, but for suicide. It was the ultimate test of loyalty. Die for the Emperor, or suffer a fate imagined to be infinitely worse. Tomiko Higa was not a soldier. She was a student. As the American advance pushed south, she fled with the remnants of her family into the caves of the Mabuni Hills. For weeks, they lived in darkness. Hunger was a physical pain, a constant, gnawing ache. Water, collected drip by drip from the cave ceiling, tasted of limestone and desperation. The only thing more powerful than the hunger was the fear. Soldiers would visit, their faces gaunt, their eyes burning with fanaticism. They repeated the warnings. Do not let the demons take you alive. Preserve your honor. One grenade is enough for the whole family. Then the moment came. The sounds of battle were no longer distant. They were at the mouth of their cave. Smoke billowed in, choking them. Figures appeared, framed by blinding daylight. They were huge, much bigger than Japanese men, their faces streaked with paint and sweat. The demons had arrived. Panic erupted. Tomiko's fingers fumbled for the grenade's pin. This was it, the final act. But her mother, starved and weak, gripped her wrist. No, she whispered. Not yet. A young Marine crept inside. His eyes were wide, adjusting to the gloom. He looked less like a monster and more like a terrified farm boy from Ohio. He saw the huddled women and children. He lowered his rifle. He said something. The words were meaningless, but the tone was not. It was tired. Then he did something that broke reality. He unhooked his canteen and offered it to them. It had to be a trick, poison. But his eyes held no malice, only a deep, profound exhaustion. A small boy, delirious with thirst, crawled forward. The Marine knelt and gently tipped the canteen to his lips. It was just water. Clean, cool water. One by one they emerged, blinking in the harsh sunlight, hands raised in surrender. They were marched to a processing camp, a sprawling city of tents under the hot sun. This, they thought, is where the real horror begins. But the horror never came. Instead, they were met by bureaucracy. They were dusted with a strange-smelling powder. Medics examined their wounds with a gentle, professional calm. The first true shock was the shower. For women who had lived in filth for months, the feeling of hot water and the sharp, clean scent of soap was a miracle. They had been told they would be violated. Instead, they were given soap and clean towels. Then came the food. Not rice and pickled vegetables. It was alien. Cans of processed meat, crackers in a box, the smell of bacon frying in a pan, hot coffee, thick with sugar, for people on the brink of starvation. This was an overwhelming assault of generosity. Their own soldiers had left them to starve. The enemy gave them hot meals. They were led to canvas cots with clean blankets. Safe, warm, full. But as Tomiko lay in the dark, listening to the quiet breathing of the other survivors, a cold suspicion crept in. This kindness was a weapon more confusing than any rifle. The propaganda had been a lie. But if this was not hell, then what was it? Why were the demons being so kind? The fear of death was gone, replaced by a new, unsettling dread. This had to be a trick, a fattening before the slaughter. The days that followed were a blur of structured strangeness. The terror did not vanish overnight. It lingered, a phantom limb of fear. Every morning, Tomiko woke on her cot expecting the kindness to end, for the true face of the demon to reveal itself. But each day was the same. The medics made their rounds. The guards patrolled the perimeter, their faces bored, not menacing. The sun beat down on the canvas tents. And then there was the food. It arrived 3 times a day with a logistical precision that was, in itself, a form of power. They were given mess kits and pointed toward long tables. The Americans called them K rations and C rations. Small, wax-covered boxes and olive-drab cans. To the women, they were boxes of profound confusion. Inside was a universe of alien tastes and textures. Crackers so dry they turned to dust in your mouth. Cans of processed ham and eggs, a bizarre combination. But it was calories. Life. A U.S. Army report from 1944 stated that the average infantryman's daily ration provided over 4,000 calories. The official ration for an Imperial Japanese soldier was less than 2,000, and on Okinawa, that was a fantasy. For the civilians in the caves, the daily calorie count had been close to 0. The enemy was feeding them twice as well as their own army had. One day, a soldier handed Tomiko a biscuit slathered with a thick brown paste. She sniffed it. It smelled of nuts, but it was smooth. Was it a type of miso, a medicine? She watched the soldier eat his, then hesitantly took a small taste. It was salty, yet sweet. It stuck to the roof of her mouth. Peanut butter. A food so common in America it was given to children, yet so foreign in this world it felt like an artifact from another planet. They were given chocolate. Not the sweet milky kind, but dense, bitter blocks called D rations. A soldier explained through a Nisei interpreter that each bar was designed by the army to have 600 calories, and to taste, in the words of the quartermaster general, just a little better than a boiled potato, to keep soldiers from eating it too quickly. The irony was lost on them. This emergency survival food, engineered from misery, was the most decadent luxury they had ever known. It was in these small, absurd details that the propaganda truly died, not in a single dramatic moment, but in 1,000 tiny cuts. The sight of a young Marine, barely a man himself, showing a child how to unwrap a piece of chewing gum. The sound of jazz music, a chaotic and joyful noise, drifting from a radio in the American compound at night. Soldiers, in their downtime, throwing a baseball, laughing and shouting with an ease that felt obscene in this landscape of death. How could a nation of devils produce such things? How could they have so much to spare? While Japan was melting down temple bells for metal, America was producing 100,000 aircraft a year. While Tomiko's family was starving in a cave, American factories were shipping millions of tons of Spam, Coca-Cola, and chocolate to the farthest corners of the world. The sheer overwhelming power of this abundance was more terrifying than any battleship. It spoke of a victory so total, it didn't even require cruelty. If you find this story as surreal and shocking as they did, subscribe now and join us in uncovering these lost histories. This realization brought a new kind of agony, a deep, unsettling shame. Tomiko would watch the supply trucks roll in, an endless river of food and material, and feel a hot flush of anger, not at the Americans, but at her own leaders. They had been told to die for an emperor who was a living god. They were given honor and speeches and grenades. The Americans gave them peanut butter. The crucial link in this chain of cognitive dissonance was the Nisei, the Japanese-American interpreters. They were the ultimate paradox. Men who looked like their brothers and fathers but wore the uniform of the enemy. They moved between two worlds, translating not just words, but intent. They explained the camp rules. They taught the women how to use the strange toilets. They reassured them when a new medical procedure was introduced. One Nisei, A quiet man from California named Kenji would talk to the children. He told them about his home, about orange groves, and something called a movie. His presence was a constant, quiet refutation of the government's central lie. The enemy was not a different species. The enemy was a man who missed his home, just like they did. Lying on her cot one night, Tomiko listened to the sounds of the camp, the gentle snores of the women around her, the distant laughter of the guards. Her belly was full. Her body was clean. She was a prisoner, living in a tent city surrounded by barbed wire. But she had not felt this safe, this human, in months. In the Empire's Japan, as a free citizen, she was an expendable tool for the war effort, expected to starve quietly or die honorably. Here, as a captive of the enemy, she was a person whose life was worth preserving. The cage had become a sanctuary. And this horrifying truth was a heavier burden than any grenade. The re-education began subtly, not with lectures, but with a movie projector. One evening, the women were gathered in a large tent where a white sheet had been hung. They sat on the dirt floor, wary and silent. The projector whirred to life, casting a flickering beam of light. They expected more propaganda, a different flavor of the same lies. What they saw instead dismantled their reality, piece by painful piece. There were films of American cities, New York, Chicago, endless streams of cars. Buildings so tall they scraped the clouds. Then, factories. An ocean of bombers rolling off assembly lines. A river of tanks. The scale was incomprehensible. A Nisei interpreter stood beside the screen, his voice calm and steady as he translated the numbers. For every one plane Japan produced in 1944, America produced 10. For every ton of steel, America produced 20. This was not a war. It was an industrial avalanche. Then the images shifted. The footage was grainy, horrific. Piles of skeletal bodies being pushed into pits by bulldozers. Emaciated figures in striped uniforms, staring blankly from behind barbed wire. The interpreter explained. This was a place called Buchenwald, in Germany. This, he said, is what real demons do. The Americans, the supposed monsters, were showing them what true monstrosity looked like. A mirror held up not to them, but to the very concept of state-sanctioned evil they had been taught to fear. The irony was a physical blow. If you believe the world must see these hidden truths to understand the cost of lies, then subscribe now and help us tell these stories. The films ended. The women were led back to their tents in a state of profound shock. The silence that night was different. It was not the quiet of fear, but the hollow silence of a collapsed universe. Everything they had been told, everything their brothers and husbands had died for, was a lie built on a fantasy of Japanese supremacy. Their nation was not a divine power. It was a small island that had picked a fight with a giant that was now showing them mercy out of what seemed like sheer, inexhaustible capacity. For some, this truth was unbearable. The shame was too great. In the weeks that followed, some women tried to take their own lives. They used belts, sharpened spoons, anything they could find. They had been saved from the honor of a grenade, only to be crushed by the dishonor of the truth. American medics, the same men who had treated their battle wounds, now worked to save them from themselves, a final, bewildering act of kindness. But for Tomiko, and many others, the despair slowly hardened into something else, a quiet, cold anger, not at the Americans, at the leaders who had sent them into the caves with grenades instead of food, the men who demanded their deaths while hiding the truth of their inevitable defeat. The concept of honor, the one they had clung to in the darkness, now seemed like a cheap trick, a word used to justify mass suicide. They began to choose a different path, not honor, but dignity, the dignity of survival. They started talking to each other again, not in whispered, fearful tones, but in conversations about the future. They helped the medics. They learned a few words of English. They began to mend the parts of themselves that had been broken, not by American bombs, but by Japanese lies. They were prisoners of war, but for the first time, their minds were becoming free. This fragile new existence continued for weeks. The routine of the camp became normal. The sound of American jazz on the radio, once jarring, became a familiar backdrop. The taste of peanut butter was no longer strange. They were survivors, suspended in a strange limbo between a dead past and an unimaginable future. Then, on a hot afternoon in mid-August, the routine was broken. A jeep with a loudspeaker mounted on it drove slowly through the camp. A Nisa interpreter's voice boomed out, ordering everyone to assemble in the central square. Immediately, there was an urgency in his tone they had never heard before. They gathered in the oppressive heat, thousands of them, their faces etched with confusion and a flicker of old fear. The American guard stood at attention, their expressions unreadable. A radio was placed on a table, connected to the loudspeaker. An officer fiddled with the dial, searching for a signal through a storm of static. Finally, it cleared. A voice came through, a high-pitched, formal voice, speaking a version of Japanese so archaic it was difficult to understand. But they knew it instantly. Every person in Japan knew that voice, though none had ever heard it before. It was the voice of a god, the voice of the emperor. That voice, crackling over the loudspeaker, announced the unthinkable. Surrender. On August 15, 1945, the war was over. For the women in the camp, the news was met not with patriotic sorrow, but with a complex, exhausted relief. They had survived. Their nation had lost, but they had won a life they were supposed to throw away. Weeks later, the gates of the paradoxical sanctuary opened. They were processed for release, given new clothes and a small supply of food, and sent back into a world they no longer recognized. They walked out of the camp, away from the barbed wire, away from the strange kindness and the peanut butter and the clean water. They walked back toward home, but the island was a ghost. Their homes were gone, pulverized into the red Okinawan earth. The landscape was a blasted, unrecognizable moonscape. Their friends and families were gone, casualties of the typhoon of steel, or victims of the mandated suicides. They had been saved by the enemy, only to return to a homeland utterly destroyed by the very ideology that had demanded their deaths. The cruelty of their own military, which had given them grenades as a final solution, now stood in stark, horrifying contrast to the mercy of their captors who had given them medicine. It was a truth so profound, so earth-shattering, that many would spend the rest of their lives grappling with it in silence. The shame of defeat was nothing compared to the shame of having been so wrong. War is a story of villains and heroes. We are taught to see the enemy as a monolith, a singular entity of evil. But the truth, as it so often is found in the smaller moments. It is found in a shared canteen of water in a dark cave, in the taste of chocolate on a starving tongue, in the unexpected kindness of a battle-hardened soldier who, in the face of an enemy, chooses to see a human being. The women of Okinawa were captured by an enemy they were taught to fear as demons, but in that captivity they found a strange and paradoxical liberation. A liberation from the lies that had very nearly cost them their lives. Their story reminds us that in the heart of the most brutal conflicts, the most powerful weapon is not a gun or a grenade, but a simple, disarming act of humanity. It forces us to ask the most difficult question of all: what is the true face of an enemy? If this story challenged what you thought you knew, subscribe and tell us in the comments what part shocked you the most.